Italian Pie is proud to support WYES and this episode of Wall Street Wrap-Up, and to promote the importance of financial literacy and education.
This week on Wall Street Wrap-Up, the Federal Reserve raises interest rates for the 8th straight time, another 25 basis points or 0.25%. What will that mean for your credit cards and home mortgages? January's jobs report shows explosive growth in the economy and the lowest unemployment since 1969. Wall Street took the news and bought back a lot of the same stock they were selling off in 2022. Can they make up their mind? I'm Andre Laborde. We've got these stories and more. It's Friday. That means it's time for Wall Street Wrap-Up. Hi, I'm Andre Laborde. Welcome to Wall Street Wrap-Up on this Friday, February 3rd. So what's better? A stronger economy, low unemployment, and higher interest rates, but inflation, or a slower economy, higher unemployment, less inflation, and lower interest rates? Well, that's above my pay grade, but that's what the Federal Reserve will have to tackle after this week's jobs report and stock market rally. Coming up at the end of the show, we're going to be showing you a statistic that if this comes through, you'll be really glad you heard it here first. Now, there's a saying in the stock market that so goes January, so goes the year. Well, if that's correct, and it stays true, the market will hopefully end in a positive, unlike last year. The NASDAQ had its best month since July, and the S&P 500 had its best start of a year since January 2019. Now, since 1950, for over 70 years, the average increase for January was 1%. And normally, February is normally down, with the next months of March and April up just over 1 and 1.5%. Well, that's the trend all the way back since 1950. Now, take a look at this. With the S&P 500, they're off to their best start all the way back from 1926. Now, it's the 6th highest for the first month of the year. The highest was in 1934. It was up 15%. But in 23, this year, we're at number 6 as the best since 1926. Well, coming up tonight, we're going to be talking about cord cutting, streaming, and television. With two experts in the field, we'll be talking with Bloomberg's Felix Gillette and the arts and entertainment editor. And also, we're going to be talking with John Coblin from the New York Times. He is the television and media reporter for the Times. They've co-authored a great book. It's about HBO called It's Not TV. Remember when it was called Home Box Office? Well, John Coblin and Felix Gillette is going to be joining us in just a moment. Well, this week in the market, the NASDAQ Composite had the best start of a year since 1975. And the NASDAQ posted a 5-week win for the week. And the S&P 500 posted its second positive week in a row. Well, this week, the Dow Jones ended the week at 33,925, and it was down for the week. The S&P 500, they closed today at 4,136. That was up 1.6% for the week. And the NASDAQ, they ended today at 12,006, and that was up 3.3% for the week. Well, let's get to our guest tonight. At one time, television was free, but not anymore. Felix Gillette is entertainment editor at Bloomberg's, and John Coblin is the media reporter at the New York Times, and they've both co-wrote a great book. It's not TV. It's about the rise of HBO, and they're with us tonight. Felix, John, welcome to Wall Street Wrap-Up.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Thanks for having us.
Well, exactly what your titles are, I'm not sure, but I will say this, I thoroughly enjoyed your book. Okay.
Thank you so much.
What made you decide writing a book about HBO?
Yeah, I would say part of it was twofold. One was that when we started the project in 2019, I've been writing about media and entertainment in New York City for a long time. So I'd watched HBO have this incredible impact on the broader culture. And part of it was just curiosity. I wanted to go back and tell the story and learn more about its history and how it happened. And then the other part of it was just spinning the story forward. There was a lot of uncertainty when we started the book, what was going to happen to HBO. HBO's parent company, Time Warner, had just been acquired by AT&T. It was very uncertain how that acquisition was going to work. And also, HBO was in the middle of this great transformation that was taking place in the entertainment world from the era of cable and satellite television to the era of streaming. And so it was very intriguing. We thought there'd be a lot of drama as HBO tried to make that transition.
When HBO first started, the three major networks, NBC, CBS, ABC, they were the dominant players. Now, today, would it be right to say that they're right now not the dominant ones, but it's now cable? And would it even be more proper to say streaming and cord cutting?
Yes, completely. I mean, sort of putting television over the internet, that has been ascendant for the last 7, 8, 9 years. And as that has happened, the ratings for the broadcast networks, the big three broadcast networks, have gone really downhill. And that also includes the cable networks as well, to the point where there are plenty of cable networks that were making original content a few years ago, like TBS and TNT, and they're not really going to be doing it going forward. So all the media world, all the investment is going into the streaming products at this point.
How do you tell? I mean, I knew that when it came to the networks, there were the Nielsen's, and you had the overnight Nielsen's that would come out, and then you'd have later on a more accurate portrayal of who watched what show at what time. When it comes to a pay prescription channel like HBO or Showtime or such, is it the Nielsen's, or how can you tell?
It is Nielsen for the premium cable networks, even though they require Nielsen is the one that measures them. But now that we're in streaming, we're in Wild West. Nielsen can measure some stuff. They can measure in the United States. They can measure if you're watching off your TV screen. But if you are streaming to, say, your laptop or your telephone, that's not going to count. And they can't count international either. They don't know who's watching in the UK. They don't know who's watching in Germany. So this has been a frustration for many producers because they want to know how many people are watching their shows.
Well, when it comes to producers, and I'm assuming also directors and maybe even actors, those in front of the camera, when you worked for network, you had the larger audience, but you had more notes and more restrictions because it's commercial. Now, when you're talking about a subscription model like an HBO, is it more advantageous to work for a company that has less oversight like HBO, but also you have less restrictions?
Yeah, I think that the fact that HBO didn't have advertisements was hugely important to the network's evolution. And there was this really fascinating period of time in the network's history in the mid 90s where HBO, initially when it started, it was the home box office, right? So it was,
Hmm.
the initial programming model was we're going to put on things that previously we would have had to leave your house and get a ticket to watch. So like boxing, sports, a comedy performance, a musical concert, a Hollywood movie, and they kind of, in the early years, really steered away from doing, TV series because that's what the broadcast networks did, and that's what they did so well. And there was this fascinating, moment in the mid '90s where HBO said, you know what, we're going to get into serialized television, but we're going to do it differently than the broadcast networks. And what can we offer show creators, producers that they can't get from the networks? The networks can pay them more money. They'll get more money in syndication. They'll have a bigger audience. So what can we offer them? And I think the formula that HBO eventually hit on was, we don't have advertisers. We can give you much more freedom than you'd have at the network. You're not going to have these endless notes from executives. You're not going to have these commercial sponsors looking over your shoulder, breathing down your neck. And we're going to let you do all the things on HBO that you could never do on ad-supported commercial television. And that turned into a very, very, very powerful formula. And once they went with that, you got this incredible string of programming starting in the mid 90s with, Oz, Sex and the City, Sopranos, 6 Feet Under, and HBO really went on this incredible run.
Do you think, and I think I'm pronouncing his name right, and when we're on television, I really want to be sure, Michael Fuchs, and
Hmm.
who was and I'm pronouncing his last name right?
You are, yep.
He was against doing series television. Michael Fuchs, by the way, was the CEO at the time of HBO in the earlier days, but he was definitely against series television for the pay subscription. Was this the reason why? Because he didn't want to get locked in, and he thought that maybe boxing events and other type comedy events and such were cheaper and easier to put on?
Yeah, I mean, when HBO started, it was a very novel concept. You have to pay us money to watch our network. We had been used to, for decades, either listening to the radio for stories or watching television for stories. It was always free. So, Michael Fuchs, in those early days, in the 70s, in the 80s, and in the early 90s, HBO was trying to do everything to differentiate itself from the broadcast networks. And when Michael Fuchs looked at what they did, he said, they do episodic television really, really, really well. But by the time Michael Fuchs was fired from the company in 19, the new CEO said, we're going to need more than that one-off comedy special. We're going to need more than that one-off made-for-TV movie. We need to keep people subscribed week to week to week, and the easiest way to do that is with episodic television.
And unlike, I guess, a gym membership where you're locked in for the year, you can subscribe to a paid television, whether HBO or others, Showtime, but you could also quit it right after your favorite TV show is finished or your special that you really wanted to watch. So this is why, John and also Felix, this is why they wanted to keep you there. They wanted to keep that hook in.
There's a great concept that one of the important figures in HBO's history, Richard Plepler, who started off doing communications at the network and eventually became head of programming and eventually the CEO of HBO, he had this great concept called the permanent campaign. And the idea of the permanent campaign was for HBO, unlike broadcast networks, HBO, he used to say, had to be elected every month. And he came from the world of politics, and he thought of HBO in some ways as a campaign. And you had to win that viewer over every time they got that cable bill at the end of the month. Like, are you going to pay that extra money for HBO? And if you are, you have to convince them. So there were no off season, there were no off days for HBO. And it was a constant struggle throughout the network's history to try and keep that customer churn at a low rate as possible.
During the early days of HBO, they found that advertisers for commercial television were aimed towards women, and the age of the demographics would be like 18 to 35 because females bought for the home, and also when you're 18 to 35, you still really haven't gotten into a brand that you really like. But when it comes to paying the bills and also who holds the remote, the man was the one usually at the house, held the remote, and also pay the bills. So with subscription, they wanted to, subscription television, say HBO, they wanted to do it more edgier, more programming that would be appealing more toward a man. Is that the way first off, do I have it right? Was that the way it was before? And is that still the way it is now?
It's exactly what happened in HBO's early days. And again, that's part of Michael Fuchs. How can we differentiate ourselves from the broadcast networks? Well, if the broadcast networks are programming for women, we're going to program for men. So then you have sports like boxing. You have a lot of nudity on the network, mostly female nudity. And this really influenced HBO's programming decisions for decades. I mean, there is a Sex and the City in 1998 with 4 female leads, but that was really an outlier for years and years and years. In fact, as recently as 2016, 57% of HBO's audience were men, only 43% were women. But HBO has made a concerted effort in the last 6-7 years, as the streaming really taken off. Let's make more programs with women in the lead, tailored toward women. And as of last year, it's a 50-50 breakdown between men and women in terms of the number of viewers or the breakdown of viewers for HBO.
When we would talk about notes, and for the sort of like a little inside baseball, when in commercial television, many times the executives of a network would send notes to the production, to the director as such, we want this, or we don't want that, or this may upset a commercial advertiser and such. And with HBO, it's very few notes. But one of the notes that I found that you had in your book, that when they wanted more cable edge. What's cable edge?
Yeah, That's Cable Edge was a code word inside of HBO, basically for more female nudity. So HBO in the early '90s was making these things they called adult sitcoms, and often the writers on those shows would get that note back, say, "Yeah, the script looks pretty good, but it needs a lot more cable edge." And again, that's what fits in with that programming philosophy where they were, kind of pandering to male viewers at that point. And it's interesting too because, a lot of their early efforts um, in serialized shows back in the '80s, they would occasionally dip their toe in it. And they realized they had to do things differently than the broadcast networks. And the most obvious thing they could do was nudity and bad language. But it turns out that just nudity and bad language actually doesn't make very good television. So it was, those early shows, some of them were really terrible, and it took them to the point, of a decade of kind of experimenting with different things before they realized, oh, what we really need are seasoned TV creators, people that have spent their careers successfully working in broadcast television, have kind of mastered those rules of broadcast television, and then they can come to HBO and break all of those rules and do things that they could never do on a broadcast ad supported show. Things like killing off the main character in the first episode, and setting show. One of their first big dramas that they really invested in was Oz, which was set in a prison. And broadcast television, historically had really not done prison shows because it was too dark, it was too violent, it was not the kind of thing people would want to spend their Friday nights or Saturday night watching. So once HBO learned to do it differently than broadcast television, things really took off.
Well, I would assume from its inception of HBO to what it is today, the cost of production of content has risen dramatically. Is the money we're talking about that HBO receives, is it only coming from subscription? Because as we talk about network, you get money from advertising. So you could always raise the advertising. And of course, I admit, yes, you raise the cost of subscriptions. But is that where they're getting their money to being able to buy the content?
Yeah, that's the core constituency. This is why that subscriber count matters so much to HBO, as well as all of HBO's competitors, especially in streaming. It's funny, if we're talking about HBO sort of pioneered paying for a television network, here we are 5 decades after it was born, and now every media company, they are obsessed with something called churn, making sure that they don't lose subscribers, or if they do, how do we replace those subscribers? So there are other sales. HBO benefited greatly in the early 2000s from DVD sales, but subscription counts and the amount of money you're earning from each subscriber is really, really significant to HBO and to all of its competitors.
Netflix now, which is a major competitor, Netflix has started their regular subscription, but they've also got an ad portion that if you wanted to pay a less amount, you would have advertisement. Do you think HBO and other like Showtime, Cinemax, and such would go this route as well?
Yes, they've actually gone that route. Since last year, HBO Max, HBO's streaming service, they've had an ad tier just like Netflix. Disney, they didn't do Disney Plus. They didn't do ads initially. They just introduced it last month. So yeah, the ad tier is becoming very popular because in the US market especially, Netflix is sort of topped out at around 70, 75 million subscriptions in the US. And that appears to be kind of the high watermark. So if there are a lot more than 70, 75 million people in this country, how do we appeal to them? Introduce a cheaper ad tier, and maybe then they'll be interested. Maybe then they will become subscribers. And all of a sudden, we got out of the world of the TV bundle, the cable bundle, where we were all spending $100, $150, sometimes more on cable every month. And now we have this a la carte streaming world. Many people have cut the cord, but these streaming services are becoming more and more and more expensive. So maybe for an HBO Max, you want the premium. Maybe for a Netflix, you want premium. But then you look at Paramount Plus, or you look at Peacock, and you say, you know what? I'll take the ads. Here's here.
That was what we had talked about before. When you're going to cord cutting and going to streaming, can the ratings be found of how good they're doing or not doing from when they're getting out of the bundle but going into the streaming?
The ratings, it's interesting that when this transition happened and everything was moving towards streaming, Netflix kind of led the way of really not sharing the viewership data with outsiders. They kept it to themselves. They didn't share it with reporters, and they didn't share it with the show creators also. I mean, it gave them some leverage in terms of knowing what was working and what wasn't. And they didn't have advertisers. For the first decade of streaming, there were no advertisers, and so you didn't have to report how many viewers were watching at any point. Now, I think as John was talking about, we're moving into this world where advertisers are really coming into the streaming ecosystem in a big way. Part of the change you're going to see is that Netflix, HBO Max, all these streaming services, if they're going to sell you a lower priced, ad supported programming tier, then they're going to have to measure those audiences much more carefully, and they're going to have to share that audience measurement with those advertisers. And as that happens, there's reporters like me and John roaming around trying to get that information, and there's a lot more ways to get it if they're handing it out to the sponsors.
What was surprising to me was that HBO always let the cable companies, the local cable companies, whether it be Comcast, Cox Cable, whatever it may be, they were always the link between the subscriber and HBO. And then when AOL bought Time Warner, it was like David taking over Goliath. They just, I'm assuming, assumed, well, HBO's got all these lists of subscribers. Now we could integrate that into our other areas of AOL and such. What happened?
Huge miscalculation by AOL, which in retrospect looks almost comical that they didn't know this ahead of time. But we do have a funny scene in the book where, these AOL managers fly in for one of their first meetings with HBO executives after this acquisition took place in 2000. And AOL had kind of sold this huge mega deal, which at that point was the biggest corporate merger and acquisition in the history of American business. They'd sold it to Wall Street. They'd sold it to the public on this idea of synergy. We're going to kind of take the data that we have on the internet. We're going to take the programming that this traditional media company has. We're going to combine those two, and it's going to unleash all of these opportunities for new creative paths, new business opportunities. And, there was this comical moment where the merger had finally gone through, and they show up and they're meeting with the HBO executives, and they say, okay, let's get started. First, we want to know, give us all your data and your customers. And there was kind of like this awkward silence. And the executives at HBO were like, I hate to tell you this, but we don't really actually have any of that information for you, because you're right. They were always a wholesaler. They always, the way the model worked is the cable distributors around the country had the relationship with the customer and not HBO. And it was kind of a colossal mistake.
Netflix was just an upstart. In fact, they were doing battle with a company many years ago called Blockbuster. And there was a thought at HBO, look, it's very small. We can offer them $2 billion, which was basically chump change at the time, and for doing it. But what happened when they broached the idea of buying Netflix?
Yeah, there was this amazing moment in 2005, 2006, where there was a group of HBO executives on the West Coast that were working on business development, and they were looking at Netflix. And this was the era where Netflix's primary business was sending out DVDs by mail. And you would go to their website, and you would look through all these titles and choose a couple. They'd send them out by the mail. And it was a really popular service. And HBO executives were looking at this, and they said, you know what? We should go out and buy this little upstart, and we combine Netflix with HBO, we would control another window, another way of reaching customers. We wouldn't have to go through the cable networks. We'd start to establish a direct to consumer relationship for the first time. This would be a nice thing to have in our portfolio. So they drew up a proposal and they put it together. It's nice, 35-page slide deck. And they went to New York and they took it to their bosses and they sat down. They said, "Here, we have this great idea that Time Warner has funds for acquiring startups, and we have the great idea that would be perfect for us. Let's go out and buy Netflix." And they started the presentation. Before they even got through it, their bosses said, "Nope, no way, we're not interested. This whole Netflix thing is a flash in the pan. It's going to go away. It's not for us." And they cut them off very quickly.
Okay, that's part one of our interview with Felix Gillette, entertainment editor from Bloomberg, and John Coblin, television and media reporter from the New York Times. We're going to be talking with them both next week, part two, for next week about the future of cord cutting and how much longer can cable survive with the growing of streaming services. That's next week, part two. Well, if you've got a question about finance or a comment about the show, love to hear from you. Make it pithy, make it concise, and write us at andre@wallstreetwrapup.info. Now for a look ahead of market info for next week. But first, what well-known catalog company opened its first store in 1925 on this day in Chicago, Illinois? We've got the answer in just a moment. Well, what well-known catalog company opened its first store in 1925 on this day in Chicago, Illinois? Sears and Roebuck. Now, I promised you at the beginning of the show that some interesting thoughts that if this happens, it's going to be a very good year. Well, when the market goes up in January after a negative year, it tends to be very good news. But only 5 times in history, in 1954, 1961, 67, 75, and in 2019, the market fell the year before and popped up more than 5% in January. Look at these numbers. For the full year, the returns were spectacular. So there's a lot of numbers there, but January ended higher. This has only happened 5 times. And in 1954, the full returns were 45%. And the lowest was in 67 when the S&P ended the year just up 20%. Well, I'll tell you December 31st if it was correct. Remember, we repeat the show on Sunday mornings. Best way, though, set your DVR so you'll never miss an episode. And that's our show for this Friday, February 3rd. I hope you enjoyed it. My thanks so much to Felix Gillette and John Coblin for joining us this evening. But as always, it is you we appreciate for allowing us into your homes tonight. Have a great weekend, a fun weekend, and with the ones you love, and a productive week as well. I'll see you next week. Remember, if it's Friday, it's Wall Street Wrap Up. I'm Andre Laborde. And remember, money never sleeps. Good night.
Italian Pie is proud to support WYES and this episode of Wall Street Wrap Up, and to promote the importance of financial literacy and education.